In this two-part video, I'm going to teach you how to make this realistic watering can and how to colour it using just petal dust and pure alcohol. No airbrush is required. First of all, you're going to need to stack and carve your cakes into the shape that you need. You'll now need to ganache your cake. Feel free to use my other YouTube videos which cover ganaching a cake and a simple ganache recipe and method. You can see that I have used a small circle cutter here to cut a small hole into my cake. I then used a knife and made the hole deeper into the cake. This is where our spout will go. Grab out your fondant extruder and start extruding strips that are long enough to wrap around your watering can. I used 5 strips and I used the second largest of a medium sized circle. Store your spares in a Ziploc airtight bag. Take out the one that you're using and just roll on your bench to take out any kinks. To glue the strips onto my ganache cake, I'm going to use black royal icing for no particular reason other than you won't see it and I had it left over from a cake earlier in the day. These strips of gum paste are going to be the ridges in your watering can. So work out where you're going to want your first ridge to sit and then add a thin strip of royal icing around your can. Take a strip of gum paste and press into the royal icing. Be careful you don't press too hard because you don't want to squash your strip. Once it's wrapped completely around, using a clean sharp scalpel blade, cut off the extra gum paste from the strip until it meets up. Using your ruler and a clean, soft paintbrush, gently manoeuvre your gum paste strip into position. Work your way around the cake until it's completely level. You may find every now and then that you may need to gently press your gum paste strip back onto your cake. You're probably having a hygiene heart attack watching my hair on the bench. Normally I'm covered in cornflour and I have my hair up, but this cake isn't going to be eaten and I'm making it and filming it between appointments and need to look a little respectable. So please guys, don't freak out on me. If you find that you're taking a bit too long and your royal icing is drying out, just dampen your paintbrush and brush it onto the royal icing to dampen it back up. Using your paintbrush, dampen if you need to. Gently work your way around now and remove any excess royal icing. Make sure that you don't bump your strip and move it while you're doing this. If you do, again get your ruler out and push it back to where it needs to be. Take your second strip of gum paste out of a Ziploc bag and work out roughly on your cake where you want this layer to go. Again, get your royal icing out and using a knife or a little spatula, do another layer of royal icing around your cake. Completely work your way around the cake with your royal icing. Use your ruler and your paintbrush to put this strip in place in exactly the same way as you've done the first strip. Again, after you have it in place, use a damp paintbrush and remove any excess royal icing. Just remember, any big clunks of royal icing that aren't removed will most likely show through your top layer of fondant. Once you've got your 2 bottom layers of gum paste in place, work out roughly where you want your top layers to go. On the top of my water can I used 3 strips, so my ridges both look different from top to bottom. Depending on how many strips you want on the top, add them in the same way as you did the bottom strips. I lined all my joins up on the back side of my watering can, all in the same spot. I thought perhaps they might show through on the top layer of fondant, however they didn't, but it's up to you whether you take this precautionary step or not. Now's a good time to do a quick measure or a quick eye over and make sure all your strips are still in place from cleaning up the royal icing. Put your cake aside now and let the royal icing set hard. And now for the worst part, clean up. And if you're like me, but it's gonna take a while. Our first step now before we put the fondant on our cake is to sugar syrup our cake. Now you really have to concentrate and make sure that you get sugar syrup on your strips, under your strips, over your strips and in the gaps. If it's not completely coated, our fondant is not going to stick and we won't be able to get the ridge effect. It has to be thoroughly coated but not wet. Rather than covering this cake in one piece of fondant, I'm going to use the wrap technique. Measure the circumference of your watering can and roll a thin strip of fondant a little larger than the circumference of a watering can. As I've shown you in my other videos, I always use canola oil spray to roll out my fondant. Because of this reason, I'm going to lightly sprinkle my strip of fondant with corn flour, because when I roll it up, I don't want it sticking onto itself. Now carefully lay your rolling pin on the fondant and roll the fondant around the pin. Gently set it aside and drag your cake into your work surface area. Okay, gently pick up your rolled fondant, place it onto the board and carefully start wrapping it and pushing it onto your cake. Keep working your way around until your cake is completely wrapped and your fondant has overlapped. If you have way too much fondant overlap, grab a clean scalpel blade and trim the excess off, but make sure you still have a good overlap. And make sure you don't cut through into your second layer, the underneath layer. At this point, if you're really worried about cutting the bottom layer, you can trim the excess off with a pair of scissors. If it unravels a bit, just put it back into place. Gently rub with your hands and make sure the fondant has completely adhered to the cake. If you find that it's a few places where it's not sticking, just lightly dampen your sugar syrup brush and add a tiny bit more sugar syrup. At this point we need a really good clean scalpel blade. If it's not clean, it's going to make your cut jagged. Okay, first of all we're going to cut the underneath layer. Gently move the flap out of the way. As you can see, mine didn't want to play nice, so I've just propped it up onto my canola oil spray can to stop it from flopping right down and tearing. Okay, now put your ruler where you want the cut to be. Grab your scalpel blade and cut through. Clean the cut up and remove the excess fondant from the strip. Very lightly sugar syrup that section of the cake again, this time making sure that you get the sugar syrup on the inside of the cup we just made. Okay, now pick the flap of fondant back up and rub it back into place. So here you can clearly see where your next cut should be. You should place a ruler parallel to where you can see this seam and cut in exactly the same way as we made our last cut. But I'm going to deliberately make a bad cut so I can show you that if your ruler does slip or your hand slips, or if you just make a generally ordinary cut, not all is lost. We can fix this seam up. So I'm just going to freehand this cut so you can see that it won't be the best cut, but we can still blend this seam in together. Like I said, this cut should have been made with a ruler exactly the same way as you just made your first cut. Also remember that when you are cutting off your excess bits of fondant, don't cut right through and cut off your gum paste strips. Freehand cut is ordinary, isn't it? But we're going to fix it. So grab your fondant smoother and from the middle inwards towards the seam, keep pressing and rubbing inwards. You'll notice how your seam will slowly start to fill in. Because we have the ridges on the top and the bottom of the watering can, you won't be able to use your fondant smoothers all the way to the top and the bottom. Just gently use your fingers and push the seams in together. Just be careful you don't leave big finger marks in your fondant though. Grab your fondant smoother out and smooth your cake out. Also rub the edge of your fondant smoother under your top and your bottom ridge on your watering can. This will slowly start to emphasise your ridges. Slowly and carefully work your way right round the cake. Don't forget to smooth out the middle of your cake as well. Now you're going to grab your boning tool. If you don't have one, probably the end of a paintbrush will do. Carefully work in between your gum paste strips with the boning tool and press the fondant in and onto the cake itself. You can see how we're now starting to emphasise the strips, how the ridges on the watering can are starting to appear. Work your way in between each of the strips from the front right round to the back. I've just realised now is probably a good time to start trimming the top of the fondant on the cake. Again, use a clean, sharp scalpel blade and make sure your blade is level. You don't want to cut downwards or upwards, and trim right around your cake. If you find that your blade is starting to stick or drag a little bit, just rub it into a little bit of kofa or vegetable shortening. Keep working your way around the top until all the excess fondant is completely trimmed away. Once the top's trimmed off, go back to your top and bottom ridges and finish working on those. You may find that you'll use a couple of tools to work on them with. I use the boning tool and I also use the small balling tool. Once I'd finished, I also used my fingers just to smooth out any definite ridges, any sort of hard, sharp lines that either of my tools had left. You also may find that your fondant dries out a little bit. That's not a problem. Just get some kofa or some Crisco, any vegetable shortening, and just rub just a little bit onto your fondant, and that's just going to stop them from cracking and elephant skinning. I apologise if I forgot to film how I trim the bottom of the can. I just used my scalpel blade and cut down the bottom, cut the excess fondant off, and I used like this palette knife tool. And I gently pressed in underneath the watering can just to press the fondant in and under. Then gently fill where the hole for your watering can spout is and place your circle cutter in the hole and cut that circle of fondant out. You may need to use a scalpel blade to grab the fondant and pull it out. Like I said before, this cake is never going to be eaten, so I've just used a really thick piece of timber quad for my watering can spout. Normally I would have wrapped these timber skewers with gum paste and just set aside for a few days to set, and then later on I would have inserted it exactly the same way as I'm going to later with the timber spout. Now we're going to cover the top of our watering can, so I've rolled out a piece of fondant just a bit bigger than the top of the can. Sugar syrup, the top of your watering can. Make sure that you get sugar syrup on the top part of the fondant on the top of the watering can as well. This is going to help smooth and join the seams together. Pick up your piece of fondant and lay it on top of your watering can. Lightly rub it into place, and then pick up your fondant smoother and smooth into place, making sure that there's no air bubbles left in there. With a clean, sharp scalpel blade, slowly start trimming the excess fondant away from the edge of your cake. I know I keep going on and on about clean, sharp knives, but if you have any old gum paste or anything left on your blade, then it's going to make your cut jagged and it's going to make your work look untidy. Keep working your way around the top until it's completely trimmed up. Now that you've got the top trimmed, you're going to take out your fondant smoother and just gently and carefully work on blending your top seams. Knead a bit of gum paste and then roll it into a sausage shape. Then grab your rolling pin and just gently flatten it out a bit. Now take your first piece of wire and press into the gum paste. Be careful you don't press the wire all the way through. Now grab your second piece of wire and put down beside your first piece. Remember, don't put it too far apart because this is going to be the width of your handle. Now fold the gum paste up and over onto your wire and press down. Gently roll it back out to smooth it out. Just roll it to the thickness that you're going to want your handle to be. But again, be careful that you don't roll out too thin that your wires start poking out. Carefully lift it up because you don't want to drag your wires out through your gum paste. Just roughly square it up onto a ruler or onto a flat edge so it's ready to trim. Now grab a sharp knife and your ruler and trim up the edge of your strip. If you need to, trim the other side as well. Okay, so now we're going to pick it up. Make sure that the 4 pieces of wire are sitting in your hand, so 2 pieces in each hand, and then slowly start bending it in. Take note that while I'm bending this handle, I'm never actually squeezing the gum paste, I'm always just pushing or pulling on the wire. Just keep pushing and pulling now until you have the shaped handle you want, but be careful you don't actually twist it. Now we're going to trim up the ends of our handle. Once you've trimmed the bottom side, flip it over and do the other side. Be really careful right now that you don't cut your fingers. Once the cut's gone right through, pull the leftover gum paste off. Once you've got this end trimmed to the length you want, flip it over and trim the other end too. Put it up against your watering can now and just double check that it's the right height. You have to make sure that both ends are the same length too, because you can't measure it, it's a little bit hard, so you're just going to have to eyeball it. If you need to, just put it back on the bench and make sure it's square and bend it back into shape. Work out where your watering can handles are going to be and just gently press the wires in just a tiny fraction just to mark where your wires are going to go. Okay, if I was going to eat this cake, I would never push the wires directly into a cake. I'd push the straw in and down down far enough that you know no wire from these handles or any wire is going to go into the cake directly. It's going to be encased by the straw. Trim the straw down flat with the cake so none of the straw will be protruding from the top of the cake, and then you will feed the wire into the straw. Use your pliers and gently feed the wire into the straw, or in this case just the direct holes because the cake's not going to be eaten. Now if I had been using straws at this point before I pushed the handle right down, I would have piped a bit of raw icing into the straw. All this would do would act as an anchor for the wire to stop the wire from moving around in the straw, just basically holding it into place. Once that side of the handle is pushed completely down, turn your cake around and do the same for the other side handle. Make sure that you've got your handle in the same position. Don't twist your handle or have it further up the cake. Okay, now we're going to cover the spout in a watering can. You can see that I've rolled the fondant out a lot thicker on one side than I have on the other side. Now the edge that will be touching the watering can, you're going to trim up square. You're going to trim the top as well, and here you can really notice the difference in thickness. Lightly sugar syrup your fondant or gum paste, whichever you've decided to use. Put your spout back in your watering can and work out roughly how far up the spout that you're going to need to cover. Now I'm just pushing in a gentle twisting motion rather than forcing it in and crumbling the cake. Pull your spout out and remember exactly how far it went in. At this point in time, mark where it needs to go with a knife or with an edible marker. Place it on your fondant and roll your fondant around the spout. Keep rolling until the fondant or gum paste meets up, and use a sharp knife to cut the excess away. Once the excess is cut away, just push the seams back in to meet up with each other. Use a bit of sugar syrup on the inside of a join, and that will stick the seams together. Sprinkle your bench with some corn flour, and now roll it. Okay, you want to keep rolling and smoothing it until there's no lumps and bumps and until the seam is hardly visible. Grab a sharp knife out and trim back to where your marking was on your acrylic or timber rod. Okay, the other end we're going to trim so the fondant still is slightly longer than what your rod is. Just give it another quick roll to get rid of any fingerprints. And then pick it up and push the end onto your bench. And that's going to flatten the end of it out so it's completely flat. Just carefully sit your spout into your watering can and have a look. You'll notice it needs to be cut probably on a 35 or 45 degree angle so you can push the spout in flush to the watering can. Mark it lightly with a knife and then pull it out and make those trims. Carefully place your spout back in and have a look and see where on the spout you still need to take fondant away, where it's stopping it from going flush to the can. Carefully pull the spout back out without squashing it and trim away any bits of fondant that still need to be removed. Add a little more corn flour onto the bench and just very, very gently roll out any finger marks we may have left in there. Careful not to roll too hard because you don't want to extend the fondant back down the pin. Just push the end back on the bench again to make sure that it's still flat. Use a spatula or a piping bag and put some raw icing into the hole. Now if you're going to have a white cake, you're obviously not going to use black royal icing. Set the spout back onto the palm of your hand to set it into the hole, and then use your finger on the end of the spout to press it back into place. Clean up any royal icing that may have squished out. Now I'm going to set a tea towel on top of a bucket and use it to prop the spout and the watering can up. I'm going to leave it probably for between 12 and 24 hours for the royal icing to set hard so the spout is firmly fixed in place. It was a last minute decision to put a handle on the back of a watering can, and I actually forgot to film this part of it. But the process was done in exactly the same way as what I did the top handle for the watering can. Just remember though, if you're going to eat the cake, always put your wires into some straws. Put some royal icing in those straws and that will firmly hold your wires into place. Don't ever put wire directly into your cake.